Okay. We have to be upstairs at 9:30 today, so we're gonna hear the bill, hear testimony, and try to work it, but any testimony, if it could be kept to a couple minutes and to the point, that would be great. And we'll go ahead. We're gonna hear House Bill 166 today, and if the sponsor would come.
Madam Chair, Committee, thank you for having me here this morning. I will review House Bill 166, which deals with education savings accounts. This is something that's been heavily studied last year, and this year we worked with it in the interim committee. I will highlight what has changed from the interim committee bill in my personal bill, and then some of the changes that the House put on it. We went through 22 tried amendments in the House, so it's been pretty heavily vetted. What I want to be clear on this is, this is nothing against Wyoming public education. I'm incredibly proud of our Wyoming education system. In 2022, our NAEP scores were 4th best in the country, and they were the very best of all the Western states. But what this bill does do is it provides some choices outside of public education. It provides funding to families towards things like tuitions, computers, private schools, CTE classes, or transporting a disabled child to medical appointments. One of the main changes that this bill does from our joint interim committee bill was this no longer includes 3-year-olds. If you remember, in our interim committee, originally 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds qualified for pre-kindergarten funds. We took the 3-year-olds out, so this is 4-year-olds only. The second part that was really changed was in our interim committee, qualified families were up to 250% of poverty level. This bill expanded that. So families at 250% or less would receive $5,000. Families qualifying from 251 to 350% would get $3,000. And those families from 351% to 400% of poverty level would receive $1,000. So based on income, this gives more choices to more families. We know that families with less incomes have less choices, and that was one of the reasons for this tiered funding level. We heard in committee, the Education Department is in favor of this bill. They're ready to implement it in a studied and practical manner. They've already reached out to some of the other 24 states that implement such programs. Last summer, I spent days at the Education Commission of States, and a lot of it was spent on ESAs. And we listened to what worked well in other states and what didn't. And one of the main things that we heard was implement this smaller in the beginning. Don't make it universal. Don't open it up to everybody. Make sure our department these first couple of years can set it up in a practical manner that works for Wyoming. So as far as some of the other large changes that went through this, things that we discussed on the House, the funds are still coming from general funds. There's nothing here associated with our school foundation funds. The bill will go through in the initial, it gives definitions. One of the things we put on for definitions was, what is a pre-kindergartner? So a pre-kindergartner is a 4-year-old, someone who would receive 1 year of instruction. So just making it clear that the 3-year-olds or 2 years of instruction was no longer part of this bill. Later on in the bill, we go through the requirements. It outlines again the income levels. Talks about how the superintendent will distribute the funds quarterly. And then it also talks about, what things qualify. We mentioned some of those earlier. Also qualifying are tutoring services, funds if someone wants to take the ACT test, funds to reimburse school districts if one of these ESA students wants to take an extracurricular course or band or CTE class. Funds are available to reimburse the school districts from there. I'll just try to give you some highlights and not go through the whole thing, but I'd like to point out some of the important parts. On page 10, we talked about what these courses have to require. So at a minimum, the ESA students will receive instruction in reading, writing, mathematics, civics, history, literature, and science. Nothing in this instruction can conflict with the parent or the ESA student's religious doctrines. The ESA student will take either our statewide assessment or they will take a nationally normed achieved exam, and that will be approved by the superintendent. We added on the House in one of our last amendments that to make sure that all the ESA students receive instruction in the United States and the Wyoming Constitution. People felt that as these are state funds, that the constitutional education should continue. As you go on the bill, what it breaks out is really the duties of the superintendent, how they'll establish the program, how things will be paid. The parents will sign an agreement on how the funds will be used. On page 14, we kept in the current allotment of funds. 70% of the funds will go to K-12 and 30% will go to the pre-kindergarten program. The superintendent will keep a list of certified education providers. On page 19, there's a part in there that we had discussed in the interim committee that I want to just point out again, that at least 2% of all of the ESAs will be audited. It gives, again, as it would set up in the interim committee, it gives the superintendent, if she does find some fraudulent activity, she can report this and work with the auditor or the attorney general. The superintendent will compile an assessment results to analyze student proficiency and academic progress among the students participating in the ESA. This is consistent with some of the other things that she gives us in our annual report to the committee, including graduation rates, proficiency, and progress. On page 22, there's a section there that I'd just like to point out and get your opinion on. I just caught this yesterday. But the superintendent may adopt rules, and what it talks about is an anonymous online reporting, or anonymous telephone reporting if someone suspects fraud. My wonder there is if your committee, if you may want to look at changing that to confidential instead of anonymous. As we work further into the bill, I kind of wanted to just get into the funding of the bill. So the way the bill is set up now, there's $20 million into the appropriation for the 2 years. Our committee bill, and I initially presented this as a $40 million amount. The House had decreased that down to $20 million. Also in the funding model, there's $480,000, so it's $240,000 a year for salary and benefits of 2 positions. We heard from the superintendent that she would probably only hire 1 initially, but the funds are there for 2 people if needed. There's also $200,000 a year for total funding of $400,000 for the 2 years to use vendors or software to help implement this program. That's what most of the other states do. There are professional vendors that will help administer this program if the superintendent needs it. I know most of you are familiar. We worked this heavily in the interim committee. I'd like to stand for any questions that you have, or if there's anything I can make a little bit more clear.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I do have one question that didn't come up during the interim, and most of this is very similar, but with the idea that the ESA parent would be contracting and agreeing to the fact that their child is not attending a public school, and that then gets them $5,000 if they're below 250% of the federal poverty level. One curiosity I had was, what if they change their mind and they've got a constitutional entitlement to public education in the state, and they basically end up attending for a short time with that $5,000 a private school and determine, well, actually, I think things were probably better off in the public school.
Mhm.
I don't know that this has any provision for what happens next, and I don't think we talked about that before. Is that something that you've discussed?
Chairman, Senator, yes, and actually in the bill, it talks about that, these payments made on a quarterly basis, right? And it outlines the duties of our public schools. So a parent would have to inform the superintendent's office that they'll no longer be attending, be an ESA student. And then it also outlines that every child has a right to public education in Wyoming. So that student would return to Wyoming, to the public school system. And then working with the superintendent, any of those funds would have to be returned to the ESA program.
Okay, so Madam Chairman, just to follow up, and it sounds like we've got it covered so that we're preserving that constitutional right that at any point that student is able to rejoin the public education system regardless of what's going on. They might have to even things out in terms of the ESA dollars, but that's what would take place. Is that fair?
Yep, Madam Chair, Senator, correct, that is in this bill.
Great, thank you.
Where in the bill that is?
Madam Chair, Senator, or Chairman Scott, yep, let me find that for you. Yeah, I think it'll be in a couple places, actually, so. I'm looking at page 28 in the beginning, that's more of talking about tuitions in the schools, disabilities. Page 26 outlines schools to be free and accessible to all children, and then goes into that. So this is all taken from our current law. And then Senator Steinmetz is correct. It talks about the agreement and the student going back to the schools, how the ESA's funds would be worked. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. We've had a lot of emails on this bill this morning, and so I just wanted to make sure I'm correct in page 12, line 14 through 19, that is the exemption for homeschoolers. And if you could go into just a little more detail on that, because I know we have a lot of people interested in that.
Madam Chair, Senator, as far as the homeschoolers, as far as do they qualify for the funds, or what kind of questions were you receiving?
The protection for them being exempted from this and not swept into it.
Correct. So, Chairwoman, Senator, no one has to sign up for this program. If there's funds, if they don't want to be part of this program, they definitely don't have to. They can keep their current program, curriculum that they're with.
Just making sure for everyone out there. Thank you.
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Page 10, lines 11 through 15. This relates to the earlier discussion. What it does is you have to certify the ESA student will not be enrolled in public school district and releases the applicable school district from all obligations. With the question is, with the homeschool population, at least our school district, and I think many of the others, have been quite receptive to taking a child on a part-time basis for a few courses, participation in athletics, courses that are not I know I've dealt with a case where what they want to do is take Latin, and there was, one of the schools, public schools was offering that, or other advanced mathematics, or other things that the homeschool parent felt they couldn't do at home adequately. This would forbid an arrangement like that. Is there any way we can avoid that, or is that
Yep.
just inherent in the nature of this beast with how we're having to pay for things?
Madam Chair, Senator. So no, in here, page 7, line 20. So services contracted for and provided by a public school district. So these funds can be used to reimburse our school districts for those extracurricular activities that you're talking about. But what we can't do is have the students be counted in the ADM for the school district. So they're either part of the public school or they're not. But what this does provide is for those funds, for those exact classes that you're just talking about. So anybody taking these ESA funds can still work with the school district to provide a better education. It just provides some funding back to that school district for those activities. Yep.
In here, we have a means test. We're not used to means tests in education. We provide education for all children. Could you elaborate a bit on what function the means test serves in this bill? Because we'll have to explain this on the floor. And what's the thinking of the House in terms of the way it's structured, the means test and that sort of thing?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, Senator. So, one of the things that we heard from other states is that we need some kind of means testing, right? What we don't want to do is have these students fall behind a year or two. They're not making adequate progress, and all of a sudden they're back into the public school system. So this is a way of ensuring that these students are still getting a good education. And that they're not falling behind, that these funds are being used in a valuable way. So the superintendent will look at others testing outside the YTOP, so some of these national tests that other states take, and then we can compare those results to other nationally mean states.
Okay, Madam Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's what I mean by a means test is we're putting the eligibility and the amount we pay based on the income of the family.
Mhm.
As if it were a Article 16, Section 6 problem. We're not talking, I'm not talking about the results test.
Oh, sorry.
I'm talking about the eligibility of the child and how much we would put in the ESA. What is the thinking in the House on that subject? How does this, is there a constitutional reason for this?
Yes, I think, we had, Madam Chair, Senator, we had brought this up last summer as an option as far as looking at the different income levels. And it was brought up that we do this with other programs in the state of Wyoming. And that was the thinking of, this opened it up to more families overall, but again, at the varied levels.
Okay. Madam Chairman.
Yes.
Let me say to other people that are testifying, this is one subject I'd be interested in commentary on. I have one further note, Madam Chair. Page. Okay, no, that's. Okay, that's fine, Madam Chair.
You good? Okay. Any further questions for the sponsor? Thank you. All
Yep. Thank you, committee, for your time.
right. Would the department like to?
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Wanda Maloney, also here with Trent Carroll from the Department of Education. And we want to speak on behalf of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. She has been vocal about support for the Educational Savings Account and does support some of the amendments that have been made at this time.
Any questions?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you. Regarding amendments, are there any key amendments to this draft that are still being sought by the superintendent?
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and Senator Rothfuss.
Madam Chairman,
Yes.
series of questions. Is the State Department of Education confident can they implement this bill on the schedule in the bill?
Madam Chair, Chairman Scott, one of the things that we have also talked about is the support of a vendor and then also the one employee. But we do believe that we have the capacity to carry this out.
Okay, but you will need the appropriation that's here, because the Appropriations Committee will question you on that, I'm sure.
Madam Chairman, Senator, that is correct. We would still ask for that appropriation.
Any further questions?
Several more questions. There are, in the state constitution, some prohibitions on the use of school funds for private education. Do you think this bill runs afoul of those, or is it, do you see any constitutional difficulties in what this bill's proposing to do?
Madam Chair, I'm going to look to my colleague to phone a friend.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Senator Scott, I'll start by saying that neither one of us are attorneys, so I'm going to be a little cautious weighing in on that question. But the commentary that's been provided is that using the general fund may avoid some of those concerns.
Okay. Madam Chairman,
Yes.
the question on the means testing is, I know we don't need to do it for constitutional reasons for students in the K-12 system. Do we need this for the preschool part, the pre-kindergarten part that is not necessarily part of the regular education system? Is it constitutionally needed there, or is this a matter of convenience in terms of focusing of what we're doing?
Madam Chair, I think what I can say in terms of representing the superintendent is that she supports the bill for all families, but understands the limitations to the funding that has been made through the amendments.
Okay.
Any further questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll go ahead and open this up for public comment. And we don't have a lot of time, so if you guys want to start filling the chairs, you may do so.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Tate Mullen. I'm the Government Relations Director for the Wyoming Education Association. I'd like to address Senator Scott's question about the means test. This was one of the provisions that we were happy to see. There's a couple of pieces that we know about ESA programs at the national level. We have seen numbers as high as 80% of the people that use these type of programs are students who are already enrolled in those programs. What this then has meant for those programs that don't have a means test is it turns out that it is subsidies for wealthy families who are already attending these schools and does not target those low-income students. The other piece related to the means test is what they have seen across the board is that these programs, the cost associated with them over time just goes through the roof. This may be a way to partially limit that impact. So that's our input on the means test. Some of the other points that I'd like to raise. First and foremost, I want to be upfront and clear. The Wyoming Education Association does not support this bill by any means. We did conduct an independent policy analysis utilizing criteria such as accountability, administrative feasibility, policy efficiency, policy cost effectiveness, and constitutional considerations that impact political feasibility. The bill fails every single one of these measures. Without getting into that, what I wanted to highlight for you today was one of our more substantial concerns, and that is the pre-K component of this bill. Some background for me, when I was in Kansas working for Kansas Action for Children, one of our policy priority areas was early childhood education. And in that work, there is a recognizable difference between early childhood education or daycare and what is high quality early childhood education. The high quality early childhood education is what provides that return on investment, higher graduation rates, higher economic success later in life, lower rates of incarceration. What this bill does, it throws money without providing the structure and the supports needed to provide that high quality early childhood education to yield those results. I will always advocate for a high quality early childhood education because we understand what that ROI is. This bill does not do that, and it essentially will throw money at what is daycare. We know there are a number of components. We have studies from the National Institute for Early Education from Rutgers, as well as the National Association for the Education of Young Children. There are benchmarks that need to be in place. There are standards that need to be in place for those facilities and for those operations to provide high quality early childhood education. Those are not in place currently. We have a number of issues that looking at current statute, looking at exemptions, looking at the age that you have to be employed, your education level. These are all concerning. So our suggestion, we would like to see a pre-K bill done right. This bill should not include a pre-K portion, and we would ask that it be stripped from this bill. And with that, I'll stand for any questions.
First, let me reinforce what the WEA said on the means test, because I thought that was a useful insight. I have seen, and I guess my source was the Wall Street Journal, saying exactly what WEA just said, that in other states, most of the people helped have proved to be people who were already outside the public school system and were in an alternate education. And it does strike me that the insight that WEA provided, Madam Chairman, that the means test does help keep it to where we're helping kids that otherwise wouldn't be able to go outside the system is important. My questions are, you're criticizing the pre-K portion for lack of high quality. What do you mean by high quality?
Madam Chairman, Senator Scott, if you'll allow me a little bit of time, I'm just going to roll through a couple of these. So again, the National Institute for Early Education Research, there are benchmarks for high quality pre-K. That includes early learning and development standards, that the teachers have a bachelor's degree, that the teachers also have specialized training in pre-K, that assistant teachers have CDA or equivalent, professional development and coaching for staff, class sizes of 20 students or lower. The staff.
Slow down just a little bit.
Sorry. Class size of 20 students or lower. Staff-child ratio, there are a number of these that depend on age criteria. There are some looking at Wyoming standards in statutes right now where we conform to those. There are others that we don't. And that's a substantial problem. I want to highlight one of those is that in Kansas, what they saw and had to enact a law because of it it led to the death of some children. And so we need to make sure that those ratios and the pieces that are in place are there to protect our kids. Curriculum supports, as well as conducting vision, hearing, health screening, and referrals. The National Association for the Education of Young Children has a checklist of 10 accreditation standards for what is considered a high-quality education, and these are pretty much across the board. Deals with relationships, right? This is that social emotional piece. How do we make sure that students can regulate their behavior, their interactions with a new person or new students? Curriculum is incredibly important. Again, this should not just be daycare. There is a curriculum that is both inside the classroom as well as the physical environment, the room outside. Outside play is important, but it has to be structured. The teacher, the professionalism of the teacher, their licensure, their accreditation, education, assessment of child progress, health, again, staff competencies, preparation and support. Family engagement is huge. This is a substantial component for a high quality early childhood education. Community relationships, as well as, again, physical environment, leadership, and management. So there are a number of components that we just don't have in place right now to provide a high quality early childhood education across the state of Wyoming.
Madam Chairman. Do you have any suggestions for what we could do in this bill to cure your quality, or let the state superintendent cure your quality concerns on the, so we're not just paying for daycare?
Madam Chairwoman, Senator Scott, it is our position that there is nothing that could be done in this bill to alleviate these concerns. We do know that on the House side, there is a study for pre-K. I think this is probably a step in the right direction. We need to understand what structures we have in place across the state. Where do our CDCs come in? Where are we short? What are we looking at in terms of the quality of educator, right? We know that we're having difficulty attracting high quality professionals to our K through 12 system. And now if we want to implement a high quality early childhood education program, we're assuming that we need educators with at least a bachelor's degree. That may put strain on the available pool of folks that we have. I think the study is probably our first route. We need to understand what we have and where we're lacking and how we can build that within different departments. I will say one final thing. Currently, as it sits, and I believe it was 2020, there was an effort to move what is currently the early childhood education from the Department of Family Services to the Department of Education. It does not lie within the Department of Education as I understand right now. So this is another significant piece that we would need to understand what that relationship looks like and how to develop that.
Madam Chairman,
Yes.
you mentioned curriculum as being an important thing. We heard testimony a couple of interims ago from a researcher who said that he thought that maybe the curriculum in the preschool ought to be focused not on the actual reading itself, but on vocabulary and increasing the child's vocabulary as a preparation for reading. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about? What are you talking about when you're talking about curriculum?
Madam Chairman, Senator Scott, that is one component. I think that what we need to realize is that high quality early childhood education isn't so much about this assessment driven, we're learning to read, we're learning to write, but it's behavior piece first and foremost, right? So if we think about your 8, 3, or 4-year-old, And all you've known so far is your family dynamic. Now you're put in this new room with a teacher or with other students. That is incredibly stressful for young kids, and some of them adapt better than others. So the first component of a high quality early childhood education is that emotional regulation. How do they address those stressors? How do we as high quality teachers make sure that those students have the resources to address that effectively? There are other pieces to that, right? The curiosity, back to some of the discussions we've had this session about bringing the joy back to education. We want those curious, more structured play, shapes of objects, feels of objects. There are a number of components. The phonics piece is a piece of it. It doesn't mean that it's just all play. There are structured pieces, but that curriculum is pretty in-depth, and it does require an educator to be able to provide it, to be trained and to be educated, which our standard says it is in the state of Wyoming. We don't currently have.
Final one, Madam Chairman. If we were to remove the pre-K, would that remove your objections to this bill sufficiently that you could support it?
Chairwoman Brennan, Senator Scott, we would be happy to see that removed. We will not support the bill. As I noted before, that criteria that we looked at in terms of the rest of the bill, it still fails those policy analysis components. So we would not be in support. This is just one piece. And the reason I bring this up is because I am concerned that we pass a bill under the pretense that we're providing high quality early childhood education that will provide that return on investment. I don't want to have to come back here in 3, 4, 5 years and defend the efficacy of a high quality early childhood education when that's not what we provided. I want to make sure if we're going to do it, that we do it right.
Thank you.
Chairwoman Brennan and the committee members, excuse me, my name is Brenna Lowry. I'm speaking to you on behalf of Homeschool Wyoming today. We represent at least 1,000 families across Wyoming. I am a 25-year homeschool mom, have solely educated all 5 of my children to graduation, and I've spoke with you in the interim committee and really respect and appreciate the language that you've inserted into the bill to protect homeschoolers. I think some of the emails that have gone out there's been some confusion on that. As we've tried to move forward, we know that this is a bill that helps a lot of people have some educational options, and we appreciate that. However, we still have some issues with how this definition between an ESA student and a homeschool student who doesn't accept public funds. So an ESA student can be a homeschooler that accepts public funds, and then there's also a homeschooler that doesn't accept public funds. So privately funded versus publicly funded homeschoolers, or basically, yeah, homeschoolers, has seemed to cause undue attention on the quote unquote unregulated, unfunded homeschool population in other states. The states that I referenced before was West Virginia. They passed an ESA bill that siloed out or left homeschoolers out of the ESA definition. However, in subsequent legislation, homeschoolers have had to fight to dampen down increased regulation that they haven't had to face before. The same thing is happening in New Hampshire this year. New Hampshire passed a bill in 2021. It's called the Education Freedom Account, I believe. And Homeschool Legal Defense is involved in their case because they're trying to impose testing on all homeschoolers, not just the funded homeschoolers, but all homeschoolers across New Hampshire. This in turn will create regulation on homeschooling, privately funded homeschooling, that is one of the strictest in the nation. So while we don't have a ton of evidence yet because ESAs are new, privately funded homeschoolers would prefer to be left out of this bill completely. And if that could be the case, in other words, that ESA funds could just be offered to charter schools and public schools, charter schools and private schools, that would be fantastic. I would like to point out that it's one of the first times I've seen us stand on the side of the education department, and that he did point out that family engagement is important for young children, and so that is what homeschooling is family engagement. So we do have research on our side, but I would just urge a no vote on this to be succinct in time, and that you would please, if the bill needs to go forward, please consider removing homeschoolers from accessing ESA funds. I'm open for questions.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. I do have a question, Ms. Lowry. So I have no doubt that many homeschoolers would not want to access this, but I can imagine a circumstance where some homeschool parents would want to access this. And I guess I'm worried right now it's written so that you could opt in or opt out, which tends to be what the legislature favors, providing the freedom that you're asking for. But at this point, it sounds like you're asking on behalf of all homeschool parents, whether they want to or not, that they be exempted from it.
Well, I will say economically, it is difficult to educate your child. For instance, in my case, I forewent my career. We went on one income, and for 25 years, chose to educate our children. The cost of educating your child at home is not anywhere near the $18,000 it costs to educate a public school child. It doesn't require that much money, so in the long run, wouldn't make that much difference. With my children, who in this economic situation probably will have to have two incomes, they would benefit from something like this. However, we feel like the freedoms that are going to be sacrificed down the road are not worth the money that we would be taking back from the government. We would prefer to see some initiative that provides a tax credit, and I've spoken with people, I know a tax credit isn't feasible in Wyoming, but some other means of reimbursement, but not, the problem is the blurring of the definitions. And listening to the House debate, I saw this very clearly the other day when this bill came on the floor, that homeschooling means homeschooling to most people. The funding doesn't really matter. Most people aren't going to clarify the funding. And so then the regulations come on publicly funded and privately funded homeschoolers alike.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to ask you whether there's amendments to this bill that can make it palatable, or are you just opposed? And let me be blunt, that often when we hear from a group they don't like a particular piece of legislation that other people feel they need, we will try to reach a compromise by saying, okay, what is it you specifically object to? How can we fix that part and still proceed with the bill? Is there something specific you can point to in the bill we need to change to make it palatable to you, or is homeschooling just going to be opposed to it?
Well, I think, as I said, if you guys, if it could be possible to change the language, I think Iowa and Oklahoma have bills that are brick and mortar or charter school, private school funding of ESAs. That would leave homeschoolers out, and I understand Senator Rothfuss. There are homeschoolers who would probably do this. In Wyoming, we do have Tech Prep, that homeschoolers can access public funds. And so if they really need public money and they want to opt in, they could sign up for Tech Prep. For us, yes, I don't think we would need to oppose the bill per se if we're allowed to not be accessing the funds, basically, because of confusion of definitions. and increased regulation. So if, to make it a blanket statement, if it's just available for charter and private schools, homeschoolers are left out of the pot of money, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The problem is, though, if you have a homeschooler who's maybe have severe reading disabilities or dyslexia, and the parents would like to access the ESA funds to get them some help with a specialist. If we limit it just to charter schools and private schools, they wouldn't be able to participate.
Correct.
So you want to take that away from those people?
As I said, we homeschooled our children privately for 25 years. We've either funded our children's therapy or people can access the public school for special education services, IEPs, and that kind of thing, if they choose to. Thank you.
I do have one more question, and I don't know if it's for you, but it gets to this conversation. The idea that it can be charter schools or private schools. I don't think charter schools would actually be eligible for ESAs based on anything that we've put in statute, because all charter schools in the state of Wyoming are public schools, and all public schools are precluded from ESA engagement. So I just want to make sure that we're clear on that discussion, that it doesn't align. It may in other states, but based on our statutory constructs, it's my understanding that this bill would not be allowed for charter school parents. And wanted to make sure that was emphasized. Thanks.
Madam Chair, honorable members of the committee, I am Dr. Douglas Petersma. I'm an independent education researcher, a small business owner that provides education services locally here in Laramie County, and I'm also a home education father. I oppose this bill for a couple of reasons. I'm going to truncate my testimony a little bit to answer some of the questions and things that have been brought up prior to this. But if you need a little bit more detail, I sent an email to the entire committee that has a little bit more detail on some of the other areas. One of the things that was brought up by the sponsor of the bill is the fact that those who decide to opt out of this program are not going to be impacted by it at all. However, the infusion of $20 million or whatever funds end up being the final dollars, I know it was dropped down from 40 million to 20, but the infusion of that money into the education market will in fact have second order effects, both on those that participate in the ESA program as well as those that choose not to participate in this ESA program. Economics 101, if you put a bunch of money into any kind of an economic system, it's going to raise the costs. In this case, most likely the cost of tuition, the cost of education products, the cost of education services. This amounts to a punitive action against those who hold convictions against these type of government programs, as I do, on the basis of the fact that I consider this redistribution, forced redistribution of funds. And those who perhaps want to be a part of this system, but they don't make the cut, they don't get their name in time, the funds are expended, and they're left out of the program. It's basically a punitive action against them because they're still going to have to be in this market and still purchase services or products, pay tuition, whatever it happens to be, if they choose to use other than government schooling services. So there is going to be an impact on those who are both in the program as well as those who are not in the program. There's a couple of other questions. Again, I addressed these in the email, so I don't want to go over them right now. But as testimony has been given talking about definitions, I would recommend perhaps some more clarifying definitions. What I would suggest would be ESA-funded school at home. If you could define those who are participating in this program as ESA-funded school at home as opposed to privately funded homeschoolers. I know there is at least one paragraph in the bill that attempts to separate out those that are homeschooling under the existing homeschooling laws. But again, along with Homeschoolers of Wyoming, I don't believe the clarity is there. And there's always the potential for what I called in the military mission creep or government regulation creep as it may pertain to legislative situations. And so like in the future, if some sort of a regulation is in fact placed on ESA school at home individuals, then there's an assumption perhaps that that is justifiable then to apply more broadly. And again, I know that's an assumption. I don't know that that's going to happen. There's nothing in the bill that says it's going to, but it's a concern that a lot of families that I work with have. The last concern I'm going to bring up is something that was also brought up by the sponsor of the bill, the anonymous phone internet recording system. The recommendation to change that from anonymous to confidential, I think, is a step in the right direction. But I don't see anything in this bill, or I don't know of any precautions that exist against nefarious usage of this system, which could amount to educational swatting. Somebody doesn't like a family, organization, I don't know who, decides to file a report, and then what is actually done? Because it's not written in this bill whether or not the state superintendent of public instruction would open up a judicial investigation, open up an audit of that family's ESA file, or exactly how that would go about, what impacts that would have on the family. I am concerned that that impacted on ESA funded schooling at home would then set the precedent to justify some sort of a similar action. For instance, are the homeschoolers actually complying with their requirement to provide civics to their family? I saw that in the bill. I'm a patriotic educator. I support civics in education. But the fact that the government is now requiring this to the point where if a person is not doing this, the funds can now be removed. The ESA can be closed on that individual because they're not complying with that requirement. If the precedent is set to do that with an ESA-funded school at home family, what would limit that from being expanded and then perhaps applied to other families who, by the way, still have that requirement under the homeschooling law to provide all of those main courses, to provide civics? It's already written into the law. So I don't believe this bill as it stands right now is salvageable or amendable to perhaps answer Senator Scott's question ahead of time. And I would respectfully request that you vote against it. With that, I conclude my statement and I stand for any questions.
Madam Chair, it's good to be here today. This was my committee for 2 years, and I appreciate the work that you do. I'm not here representing the homeschool community. I'm here representing myself and my wife as citizens who are homeschool parents. I have looked at the bill, and I believe that it does protect my wife and I and our ability to educate our son in the manner that we wish. But I will tell you this, my wife and I do not want increased regulations on homeschool parents. We do not want to be mandated for state and federal testing, and we certainly don't want data mining through those tests. And the simple answer to that is that we don't take the money. That's the answer to this. I support this bill as it stands now because I believe it does protect my wife and me with regard to how we teach our son and the values. But most importantly, we were drawn to being homeschool parents because we decide the curriculum. We decide what we teach our son, and we want that freedom protected. And I know that you all are going to need to make sure the homeschool issue in this bill is done correctly. And so I look forward to your final product. I reserve the right to vote against this bill if homeschool parents are not protected, but as it stands right now with the homeschool exemption, I can support this bill, and I obviously support the concept of where this bill is going. But I ask you to think hard about the homeschool issue, because the homeschool issue will be the hiccup of this bill if it's not done right. So with that, Madam Chair, thank you.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your service to our state. I know your job is often very thankless, so thank you. I appreciate what you're doing. My name is Lindsay Sears. I'm a homeschool mom of 12 years, and I'm here today to voice my opposition for this bill. While I believe this bill is well-intentioned to help families and let them choose the best educational option for their children, we need to be careful that this bill doesn't muddy the waters. I'm echoing the testimony of many who have already come before you. I want to put before you a quote from former U.S. Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. She was quoted as saying, "Look, if it's public dollars, it's public education." And that's what homeschooling will become if we enact this bill. I'm a firm supporter of a parent's right to direct their children's education. However, I oppose public funding for private education. Over the years, homeschoolers have sought to roll back needless government intrusion and not seek government help. Many states have begun to implement ESA programs, and we have seen that all it takes is one bad actor to bring in unwanted regulations and try to lump traditional, privately funded homeschoolers in with ESA students in future legislation, and our rights are being eroded, such as what's currently happening in New Hampshire. Taxpayer-funded education dollars means forfeiting parental educational freedoms. While these programs often provide more freedom than sending your child to public school, where nearly all the educational choices for your child are made by others, I stand for the freedom of parents to choose how they educate their child without government restrictions. This bill requires standardized testing and allows the superintendent to establish an agreement of unknown content. As we've seen in the testimony on the House floor and proposed amendments to this bill already, there are many who would seek to impose further stipulations and oversight on these funds. And rightfully so. When taxpayer dollars are funding something, there ought to be oversight and accountability. But I, for one, do not wish to enter into such an agreement with the government and do not want to see any unintended consequences if we get bad legislature down the road. If you want to help homeschoolers and private schoolers, how about considering a tax credit or offer this program to private schoolers and leave homeschoolers out? On average, a homeschool parent spends between $300 and $500 per student per year. I would say that that's probably on the high end for curriculum. Most often, a family that decides to homeschool is sacrificing an income in order to educate their children. The financial aid that this bill would provide is likely not going to make or break any family's budget. No matter how you look at it, choosing to educate at home is a sacrifice that parents must carefully consider before jumping in. If you want to pursue an ESA bill or this ESA bill, I would ask that you eliminate options for families to participate at home and only focus the bill on private schools, such as the bill recently passed in Iowa. Thank you for considering my statements and keeping in mind the best interest of homeschoolers in our great state. I stand open for questions.
Madam Chair, Senators, thank you for everything that you do. My name is Erin Waskowitz. I live in Laramie County, and my husband and I have 2 children that we've homeschooled since 2020. My family is actually the perfect candidate for this bill. We're a single income household who want a better education for our children, and we can't afford private schools, so we homeschool. We've watched our property taxes double over the last 9 years and have frequently grumbled about the money going toward the education of other children and not our own. It would be fantastic if we could get some of our money back and put it toward our own children instead of the poor performing public school system. Even though I love the idea of my money going towards my children, this bill is just not the way to do it. I've been assured that this bill silos homeschool families and therefore protects them. But in reality, you have no way of knowing that. You can't predict future legislation any more than I can. The reality is that more and more people are pulling their kids out of public school, just like we did. We're enjoying that freedom to do so, but history tells us that the more popular something becomes, the more regulated it will get. The reality is that homeschool is not what it was 20 years ago. Today, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of options to educate at home, which is fantastic. But it also opens the door to question, where is the line between homeschooling and in-home education. You see, there is a much deeper motivation for true homeschooling. My family has experienced a transformation that I can only attribute to choosing to homeschool, which is why we continue to do so with a financial strain. I fully understand that we do not have to participate in the ESA program. However, I urge you to look at the bigger picture, look at the unintended consequences. This bill will end up encroaching on current homeschool laws in Wyoming. I believe it has a high potential to fundamentally change the fabric and intent of homeschool. There is a fundamental difference between homeschooling and in-home education. One promotes freedom for individual families, and one latches onto an existing education system like the public school. I'm not criticizing one over the other, rather pointing out that there is a very big difference between the two. We should have freedom in education. Each family should be able to choose how to educate their children. This bill doesn't do that, though. This bill, although wonderfully meaning, paints families into corners, government corners. It takes advantage of a family's desire for education freedom and their economic circumstances and paints them into a corner. This bill will promote in-home education, therefore leaving the doors wide open to change what homeschool is. Our founding fathers created our government to protect our God-given rights. Does this bill do that? Could this bill go against that founding principle? As I stated before, I would love financial help with my personal choice to homeschool, but it's not the government's job to do that. The way to fix this problem is to stop taxing us to death so we have more of our own money to spend as we choose. I understand you're under a lot of pressure to pass this bill. However, I urge you to do one of the following things. Either completely remove homeschool from this bill, clearly delineate between homeschool and in-home education, or just simply vote no. Like I said, I know the idea of this bill is wonderful. I love the idea, but you have a responsibility to protect our God-given rights. Please vote no or table this bill for the interim. There's got to be a better way to accomplish education freedom in our state. It shouldn't take 30 pages to give us education freedom. This bill is too complex and it has too much potential for blurring the lines of true homeschool and to create disasters. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and committee. I appreciate the opportunity to just reflect on all the work that you all have done through the interim, and I'm sure you guys have learned through all of the discussion so much about the process. I want to also say that I am very thankful for the way that this bill goes into great depths to protect homeschoolers. And there was furthermore an amendment brought in the House to clearly delineate that there is protection for homeschoolers. It's found on page 12, line 16, and it just simply says that an ESA student receiving individualized instruction in a non-school setting shall not be construed to be a student of a home-based educational program as defined in the statutes. And so with all of that, I just want to say I appreciate how hard you've worked to protect homeschoolers while still offering the opportunity for many people to receive an education at a school of their choosing, protecting parental rights. One thing I do see in this bill that is problematic is the means testing found on page number 5. There's a couple of things. First of all, is the question of how that would be administrated. You know, do people turn in some sort of federal tax return to demonstrate how much they have received, so that they can figure out how far they go with the means testing? That's number one. Number two, there also is a fundamental unfairness to a person who may be paying taxes and still cannot receive a small portion of those taxes back, regardless of their income level, if they have a child that is of age to be educated. That means that they are educating other people's children, but can access basically 1/5 of that money so that they can educate their own. And so that's one of those things that I think may be a fundamental unfairness. My recommendation would be to strike page 5 there, which is the means testing portion, And at a minimum, you'll also see if you choose to leave it in. Right now, we have 30% of the funding going to one age year, that is the 4-year-old age year, and 70% of the funding going to 13 age years. And so there is, if you choose to leave the means testing in, I really believe that that needs to be addressed. And so with that, the other thing too, when it comes to what was an amendment on the other side that is called the Newsom Amendment, that calls for a study of the US Constitution, my recommendation, instead of going into the depths of how that amendment is written, one could actually put this into the bill and just talk about civics education, which is already in the bill, including the study of the US and Wyoming constitutions. It would accomplish almost the same thing, but it wouldn't have the kind of onerous burden that I think doesn't belong with an education savings account program. And so those are just some things that I think that we could address. And so with that, Madam Chairman or Vice Chair, I would stand for any questions.
The last part of the testimony where you said there was an amendment that's as I understood was a problem. Could you identify where in the bill that is?
Yes, sir. Forgive me. So what is called the Newsom Amendment on the other side, I have tried to locate it in the engrossed version. I could track it on the House version, but I for some reason cannot find it right off. And I could look through the bill. Maybe someone else could help. But
It's on page 11.
thank
Page
you very
11?
much.
Thank you. Lines 9 through 17. Page 11, lines 9 through 17.
That's right. That's right. Under, Madam Chairman, another place one could put that, though, and essentially achieve the same thing, would be on page 16, and simply after the word civics, potentially just put in the words including the US and Wyoming constitutions. And so you would accomplish almost the same thing, but it would still keep that careful bifurcation between the education savings account program and other systems out there. I think it'd be a better fix.
Any other questions?
Madam Chairman, second question is on the removal of the means testing. You heard the earlier testimony from the Education Association
Yes, sir.
that one effect of the means testing is to focus the bill not on people that are already getting and paying for private education, but on people who cannot afford it. And that is a virtue of the means testing. Like your comments on that thought. Are we just opening ourselves up with this without the means test to simply funding what is already occurring in private religious education, particularly?
Madam Chairman, Senator Scott, I appreciate the question. And I think one of the things that people don't recognize, especially with how things are adjusted through cost of living today, when we tie things to the federal poverty level, the way that is adjusted for cost of living, and say, forgive me if anyone is from Alabama or Mississippi, that cost of living and that federal poverty level affects people very differently there than it would in many parts of the state of Wyoming. And so as a result, when you look at that, would it fund only the people that are currently receiving an education? No, I think it opens the door for other people to finally take part in something they want. The reason I say that is if you send children to school, it's almost like taking on, I can say this from personal experience, is taking on essentially another mortgage. And that is cost prohibitive to many people out there. And that's not related to the federal poverty level or to means testing. It's simply, there's a barrier that locks many people out of taking advantage of opportunities like this. And the means test really is fundamentally unfair, and also it blocks people who could use this from getting the education they need.
Any further questions? Any further questions?
Thank you, committee.
We're running up against a time crunch, so we'll take testimony from the two gentlemen that are sitting here, and then we'll carry this bill over until Friday.
Yes.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Before that point, I'd just suggest if anybody traveled, maybe we'd give them an opportunity so that they wouldn't have to travel back. I think it's important to hear from them first.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Did you travel to get here?
I live in Rock Springs, Wyoming.
Okay, go ahead.
My name is Heather Hager, and I am a homeschool parent now for the last 10 years. And I'm going to read this, so I apologize. Everyone agrees that children should be educated, right? We may not agree on who's responsible for meeting that out. The bill for ESAs sounds good, and a lot of my friends homeschooling want it. They want to take the money. And a lot of well-meaning people I know have put a lot of work into this. But I believe it is nothing more than another welfare type program. It's another iteration of socialism and will cause an even more dependent mindset on the people. The Bible talks to us about education, and parents are the ones who are responsible for it, not the state. Education is the parents' responsibility. If we are to be free, moral, to thrive as a Christian nation, then parents need to sacrifice. I'm paying my taxes so that kids can go to public school, so that that is able to be funded. I'm also paying for my kids to be privately educated. And there's a parable that Christ talked to us about if we're forced to walk 1 mile with the Roman carrying their burden, that we weren't supposed to just walk 1 mile. We were supposed to do it confidently with a good spirit and to walk 2 miles. I feel that parents, we've become lazy. We've abdicated our duties to the state, and some of us, unfortunately, have become bad examples. But giving money that belongs to someone else, to others, isn't the way to do this. That's not what education should be. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Senators, I speak in support of this bill. Thank you for allowing me to speak this morning and for all that you do. I'm Merle Smith, Executive Director of Shine Hills Christian Academy. We're a pre-kindergarten through 4th grade private school, 94 current students. We'll extend that offer through 6th grade next year. We've been in existence a little over 6 years. We do start our day with prayer, reading from God's word, and saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Throughout our day, we focus on core subject areas. Many of our students are reading above their current grade level. If a student has a meltdown during the day, we can comfort them by praying with them. And the parents are excited when the students come home and can share a verse with them that they've learned from that day. But they also go home and read with them. A year and a half ago, I retired from public education from almost 30 plus years in different areas of education. The majority of that time was in administration. Over that time, I saw the decline in moral values in our students. I know that it did not help during a pandemic where schools shut down and students stayed home. If you had a single parent family, that parent had to make ends meet and obviously still go to work, which in turn left the students unattended. My point is that we're offering a solid education with a Christian values approach. I understand there needs to be accountability anytime there's public funding involved. we accept that, such as a national norm reference test. It's just one other option for parents to consider. Thank you.
Questions? Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chairman. Appreciate everyone's comments, and I took a lot of notes. I'm not going to delve into all the reasons why I believe this legislation is good. But that being said, my name is Tyler Lindholm. I'm the State Director for Americans for Prosperity. The handout that you're getting is actually lines out specifically where in this legislation homeschoolers are exempted out. Those amendments were made to ensure that homeschools are not brought into this legislation. In fact, Madam Chairman and committee members, of all the states that offer private education choices to families, my organization, we have not seen a single state alter its homeschool statute and place additional regulation on homeschool families because of the passage of an ESA bill. And I think that's super important to note. I don't want to discount their testimony because I think it will be, the onus will be on you as members of the legislature to ensure that accountability stays in place. However, that accountability is currently in this legislation, and I'll ask you to support it. Another thing that I heard, Madam Chairman and members of the committee, is the risk of tuition rates going up because of a $20 million hike. Madam Chairman, members of the committee, the oldest and largest ESA program in the United States is in Arizona, and they indeed did see a tuition rate hike over 10 years of 0.25%. Essentially, they didn't see anything. It actually couldn't even beat inflation. Inflation stayed much higher than the actual tuition rate hike was seen. So I don't believe that to be an actual concern based on the studies that my organization, Americans for Prosperity, has done. With that, Madam Chairman, members of the committee, I'll give you the rest of your time back. I hope you support this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Thank you. Yes.
Quickly, does your organization have any position on the comments that we heard on the preschool portion of this, that it wasn't necessarily high quality?
Madam Chairman, to Senator Scott's question, my organization doesn't take a position for or against the pre-K portion, but I will note that there are no public pre-K allowances in this legislation, that those funds would have to go to a private pre-K. And with it being narrowly put down to the 4-year-old aspect, it might be interesting to put an automatic transition in. Right now for K through 12, students that are enrolled in an ESA automatically can enroll for the following year. It might be a good possibility to, in order to bolster our private school communities, to make it so that a preschool student could automatically enroll to a private school the following year, so that we have a better way to transition that pre-K piece.
Any further questions? All right, Representative Clouston.
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee, and everyone who spoke today. I can tell you one of the things we really tried to put into this was to protect the homeschoolers, but also to give them an option if they wanted some funding to help with their education. Wyoming, I feel, has a responsibility to provide whatever education we can to help all families, and that was one of the goals of this legislation. I do want to point out on the pre-kindergarten part, all pre-kindergarten schools have to be certified by the superintendent. So that's on page 4. So this is not just daycare. They have to meet pre-kindergarten requirements, and that's in this legislation. As far as the funding for the pre-kindergarten being at 30%, that's in there. And you have to remember that this pre-kindergarten is available to all students. And from there, those pre-kindergarten students may go on to public school. They may go to private schools. They may go to homeschool. But this is a way to get our pre-kindergarten students up to a level to help provide benefits for the long term. We've heard in testimony from the kindergarten teachers that a lot of these students now are coming in completely unprepared. They're spending all kinds of resources and time with these unprepared students, really to the detriment of the other students in kindergarten that know a lot of the skills that they need to have. So the pre-kindergarten piece, I think we will see benefits long-term for these students and for the state of Wyoming. Thank you. I'll stand for any further questions.
Any further questions? Okay. With that, we're gonna adjourn for the day. We'll pick back up on Friday. We are not gonna close public testimony.